Awesome. Thank you everybody for hopping on this evening for the first part in our 3-part webinar series about the high academic recruiting process, featuring Head First and our great friends and recruiting advising partners from Diamond College Advisory Team. Tonight, the first part will cover approaching the high academic recruiting process. Where do you start? What are some of the first steps? And how are we kind of framing and defining this process as well? Before we dive into the content, I want to give you a quick look at what the agenda is for the evening. So some introductions with who you'll be hearing from and kind of who we are, what DCAT is. We'll talk about how student athletes and families can start identifying their target schools and thinking about holistic fit as they start the recruiting process. We'll define and frame what is unique about the high academic recruiting process as compared to the process that a lot of your teammates or classmates might be going through. And then we'll talk about kind of interesting to now, there's been some changes in recruiting. What has changed due to the pandemic and the NCAA guidelines and all these other things that are ongoing? What has changed between 2020 and 2021? But then also what has remained the same and what are the consistent themes and things that we see in the recruiting process? And then towards the end of the evening, we'll dedicate as much time as possible for a Q&A, as long as, for better or for worse, as long as there's anybody who is willing to be asking questions. Bonnie and I will stick on and be willing to answer any questions as they come in. To send us those questions, you can certainly hold off and send those to us at the end of the evening, or you see a little questions tab up in your GoToWebinar toolbar. And if a question pops up in your mind at any point this evening, send it in there. There are some that I'll probably reply via chat directly during if it's more kind of personal or one-off, or I'll save them and I'll start I'll kind of MC those as we get to the Q&A portion. First up, introductions. Bonnie, could you please introduce yourself?
Oh, sure. I mean, normally you're giving me the show, Max, but thank you for having me here, and thanks everybody that you're joining us tonight and giving us the privilege of your time. I'm Bonnie Pettis, and I work for Diamond College Advisory Team. And as the slide will tell you that I graduated from Yale University, where I played both softball and basketball at the same time, mostly because I didn't know any better or know any different at that time of my life. And it was probably some of the best opportunities that I had to learn and grow. And softball ended up taking me around the world. I started my coaching career at the University of Connecticut. Could not have started in a better place for women's athletics. From there, I moved on to the University of Southern Colorado and then came back to the East Coast to Furman University in Greenville, South Carolina, which is where I have been located for 25 years. I just thought I would stay here a couple of years, but I've never left. And then I've spent a lot of time as a pitching coach for the Great Britain national team. And during my stay at Furman, I was twice named the Southern Conference Coach of the Year, which was a great honor. And what I do with Diamond College Advisory Team is work with student athletes, female softball players and their families who are going through this high academic pursuit. And I am the guidepost and the person who can help read the tea leaves and kind of demystify the whole process, because you're going through it for maybe the first time, but I've been through it for 30 years. So thanks for being here tonight.
Thank you for joining us, Bonnie. And as Bonnie is wont to do, a little bit of an undersell on herself. I mean, I think that the having the experience of having softball literally take you to Beijing and Caracas, one of the cooler bio bullet points that I ever have the chance to introduce. So I always appreciate that. And Bonnie and DCAT are our go-to resources on the recruiting process, especially given Bonnie's experience on both sides of the recruiting desk, so to speak, having recruited student athletes, having been through it as a student athlete herself in 2 sports at a college that I'm sure a lot of you have your hopes set on, but then also in her experience in taking a lot of families through this process and bringing that experience to bear. I think that the recruiting process is pretty odd in that you only get kind of one shot at it because everybody's is different. And so the first time you're going through it, you feel like you have to nail it. And so it's really useful for me when I talk with families to have Bonnie as a resource and a guide to point to have all that experience to bring to bear. My name is Max McKenna. I'm a senior manager of marketing here for Head First Honor Roll Camps, where I've been since 2014 full-time. I played baseball at Amherst College, where I graduated in 2011, went into teaching and coaching, first at Phillips Andover Academy up in Massachusetts, and then at a small boarding school outside New York City called the Masters School. I interned for Head First in 2010 and 2011 when I was finishing up my college career, and then came back, as I mentioned, full-time, gosh, almost 7 years ago now, which feels like forever ago, and have been working really closely with this division and with this program with student athletes and families like you all ever since. And so I'm really fortunate and really happy to have that chance every day. Bonnie, as we dive in, could you give just a kind of brief overview of, and you mentioned a little bit of this, but kind of what DCAT is, what are your kind of tenets as you go through this process with families?
Sure. So Diamond College Advisory Team is, if you look really hard across the country, we're the only advising group that strictly works in college softball, college baseball, in the high academic college space. There are lots of people who do lots of different things, but between Justin and I, we have more than 50 years of experience in college coaching in the college world. So I'm kind of dating myself a little bit, but with that comes that experience of taking families who are in the midst of this, again, this massive pursuit. You've been playing college travel ball since they were 10 or 12 or 14, and now the time they're trying to sort out where do they want to go to college, and how can softball help them get into a school that is already very, very difficult to get into, and how long is that process, and what do we do, and how do we go there, and not only talking about the softball pieces and dealing with the specifics of how does a student and a family look at what they're looking for in terms of school. One of the great things that parents also really like about how I work with students is it helps them get separation from their daughters during a really stressful time. And moms and dads don't have to be the taskmaster. And it's really funny that I'll get a lot of phone calls. They'll say, would you please talk to so-and-so? Because I tried to tell her the same things you say, but it comes out that, you're the expert. It comes out differently. So that is just a nice piece of being able to be a different voice from outside the family unit.
Absolutely. All right, now to dive in on kind of the meat and potatoes of the evening. First, we're going to talk about building a school as kind of a natural place to start with the college recruiting process for those of you that are kind of beginning this process, or even if you're midway through, kind of thinking about revising, retargeting. A school list is never necessarily a set list. You're like, great, I set these 20 and now those are the only ones I'm thinking about. There's constant flux on that, or at least I certainly think that there should and can be. When we talk about building a school list, one thing that I see student athletes do a lot is because of the name, we say, hey, you need to build a school list. Quite naturally, they start to list school names. But when I talk about building a school list, and when I talk to Bonnie about this, when I talk to student athletes about this, what we are really referring to is, what are the school qualities? What are the qualities that you're looking for in a school? And I always find that those are what actually impact the student athlete's experience on campus. And so those should go to the forefront over the school name. And as you see here, school qualities should also take the forefront over a league or a conference. I think that in athletic recruiting, as you go through this process, the recruiting process, in a little bit different than the typical admissions process, you have kind of this natural group of quote unquote peer schools, right? Because if you're looking at one Ivy League school, you would think that you can start to group them and say, oh, these schools all play against each other, therefore maybe I'm interested in more than one of them. But when I hear a student athlete say, I'm interested in Ivy League schools, or I'm interested in NESCAC schools, or I'm interested in Patriot League schools, or whatever it is, or I'm interested in SEC schools, it turns out that those conferences and those kind of labels that athletics has given to some of these schools and kind of group them together for their conference and league play, they often kind of obscure some massive differences in the experience between these different schools. So when I hear a student athlete say, I'm interested in Ivy League schools, what they're saying is, I'm interested in Columbia, which is in the heart of one of the biggest cities in the world and has 6,300 undergrad students. And I'm also interested in Dartmouth, a school of 4,000 that's in rural New Hampshire, very different from Hanover, New Hampshire, very different than New York City. And I'm also interested in Cornell, which is in the same state as Columbia, has very little else in common, has a couple other kind of peer schools close to it, but very much is a rural college town, 15,000 undergrad. It's a half public institution. So I think that when when we start to build out lists of schools with our student athletes, I think that I tend to start from school qualities. And some of the places that I like to start are, you see down here at the bottom, school size, or even better, average class size, because I think that sometimes if you look at a school of 10,000, a school of 3,000, that top line number it doesn't necessarily come into play in the day-to-day experience of that school, but class size does. If a bigger school translates into bigger class sizes, then that is going to impact your academic experience fairly significantly. Geography. How is it on a coast? Is it near mountains? How close to home is it? All these different things that contribute to where you are in the country. Is it in the Midwest? What's the climate like? Are you coming from Southern California and now all of a sudden you're in Minnesota? That's a very different winter. All these different things geographically. Academic focus. Does it have the major that you want? And not only that, but beyond that, does it have a kind of specific academic focus in the area that you're looking? If you want to be an engineer and you're looking at Amherst College is a great school. I loved it. It's a great school. Don't go there if you want to be an engineer, if you want to major in engineering, because that's not something that they have or have a specific focus in. So kind of keeping an eye on the academic focus, and also kind of where is it in relation to the nearest city or town? Is it in a city? Is it just outside a city? Is it 2 hours from the nearest city? There are more things here as well. But I think that these are some of the ones that I tend to start with because they impact the day-to-day experience of the student athlete on campus so significantly. One other thing is you'll find that not all of these are equal. When you start to build out your school, you might not care what the average class size is, but you do really care how far away it is from home. Or you place the #1 emphasis is that they have a specific focus on your major, but you don't necessarily care if it's 20 minutes close to a city or if it's 3 hours away from a city. So kind of weighting what these different qualities are as well. Bonnie, anything to add? Any thoughts on kind of these qualities or how you start setting this list of schools when you talk with student athletes?
Sure, yeah. I mean, you've done a great job, Max, in laying out the framework that is a proven process and proven to be successful. And it helps young ladies be able to have something to sort of bite onto. What does it feel like? And the other way that I pitch it to everyone is to say, excuse me, we're going to have schools that are going to be academic fits. We're going to have some that are going to be academic reaches. We're going to have some that are softball fits and softball reaches. If we have 3 in each of those boxes, now we have a dozen schools. So that is what I do with students, is to say, okay, if you like this one particular type, here are a couple more that I'd like you to research or that we're going to talk about. And we're going to put the dream ones on the board. We're not going to shy away from them in any way at all. We're going to go for it. And we're going to look at ones that are matches along the way. And quite honestly, some kids, this year, a class of 21 student, I suggested a school, suggested University of Rochester to them, and they had never really heard of it, didn't talk about it. She's on her way, she's going to pitch, she's going to play first base, and she loves it because it was the place for her. And after listening to her describe a bunch of other places, I said, yeah, you really should check this one out.
And I think that's a really important point. And if you approach this from a school quality list first, you build out the list of qualities of I'm looking for roughly X size school with an academic focus and Y that's Z hours away from a city, or whatever your specific list looks like. I think that it is important to keep that list in mind, but then also kind of have an open mind when it comes to the specifics. And you're thinking, okay, I know of these 15 schools that fit the criteria that I'm looking for. There's probably 10 or 15 more that might be the perfect fit for me once you put softball in the picture and once I learn a bit more about them. So if you're approaching this from a school qualities and an open mind, then you're going to have that sort of thing. And that's why I think that your school list can, you want to give it as much thought as possible, but it also can be in flux, as maybe you've never heard of the Rochester Yellow Jackets before, but then you get on campus and you're like, oh my God, I have to be here because it hits all of the things that I'm looking for. And so that all of a sudden then makes its way onto your list. And Bonnie, you mentioned kind of this academic reach, softball reach. Could you talk a little bit about when you're building a school list with your student athletes, okay, how do I set kind of the softball parameters of where I'm looking? Because that's a really obviously important piece of the puzzle as well.
Sure. Well, the first place I think that any student athlete, we're working with softball student athletes, is to have an objective evaluation of their skill set. where do they fit? Where do I fit? Where does my daughter fit as a softball player? And there are many very good travel coaches who have connections and relationships with lots of schools, but they may not all, your daughter may not be on a team with all high academic students. So that coach that has ties to, the Big Ten or the SEC or Big East or something may not have as much experience with that. So you have to have someone who is experienced with knowing the league and knowing what players are how players are situated in each of these types of schools. So for the last 5 years, I've been evaluating students at Head First Honor Roll camps, and I see typically about 1,000 kids per summer. And I got the groove on it to know which players are potentially Ivy, which might be Patriot League, which might be NESCAC, which might be the MIAC in the Minnesotas, which might be the SCIAC in California. I'm really just being able to take skills and to say, mom and dad, player, here's where I see you. You tell me where your dream is. And if there's a big gap, we'll talk about how to get there. And at the same time, we'll say, okay, where do your skills fit to this potential program? And that's just really a lot, again, based on my work experience, my evaluation experience. I didn't really mention before, not only did I play in the Ivy League, then in coaching in the Northeast, I've traveled around to all of these campuses and know a great deal about them. I was also a Division I basketball referee for 15 years. I've been on every Ivy League campus, every Patriot League campus, to and fro. So I've seen a lot of places.
And I think that's so important. And as you mentioned, like getting that honest assessment, I think takes obviously getting to see the student athlete and getting a sense of, where she falls in the field and where that might lead to. I think that one kind of hole sometimes is you'll talk with some travel softball coaches, and we partner with a lot of really, really excellent travel softball coaches, and a lot of them have really good relationships to college coaches. One thing that can be really tough though is to understand where a student athlete should fit at the college level. You have to have watched a lot of college softball of all different levels. If you've only ever seen, the Softball College World Series, then that's the level of softball that you're working off of. That's great. How does that backtrack in parallel to the right softball fit at McAllister or the right softball fit at Grinnell, or Division III generally? Kind of how do you set those boundaries and kind of set your own eyeballs on, when I see this type of player, I'm watching them, but I also have this frame of reference at all different levels of college softball to understand where they might fit in. And a lot of travel coaches, a lot of people generally haven't necessarily seen all these different levels of college softball to have those gauges kind of calibrated effectively.
Mm-hmm. Max, if I can jump back on with one other piece that I forgot, the main piece I forgot about evaluation is when you or your daughter has come to a Head First camp and I'm there, we offer over the phone evaluations after the camp. We haven't been able to be in person for a little while. So what I want to make sure I offer to you is that if you would like to email me some clips of your daughter, or if you're a student athlete, clips of yourself, 5, 6, 7 swings, some pitches, some ground balls, whatever your primary positions are, I'd be happy to take a look at them and have a conversation. Like, no strings attached. I do this a lot. I talk with a lot of families. If it's a good fit, great. If it's not, I still want you to have the information about how to go forward and what's really good. What's an honest evaluation of where you are now.
Absolutely. And so that's kind of the first bullet of getting an independent third-party evaluation. I think is like, that's the dream. If you have somebody who has all this experience, as Bonnie does, and has access to your video or has seen you play in person, getting that honest, candid third-party evaluation saying, look, here's where I think you fall out right now. Let's talk about where that is and where that might grow, because obviously, your on-field potential is potential, and there's growth, and it's a process. And so it's like, okay, here's where you are now. Here's where you want to be. Here's where I think you can get. Where are kind of the gaps, and how can we close them? There are other ways, I think, to help get a sense of that as well. They require a little bit more growing pain and a lot more kind of self-honesty. And one is, whenever you go to a tournament or a showcase, you're playing against probably some of the better college-bound student athletes in the country, depending on what tournament it is and where it is and what coaches might be there and how big it is, et cetera. But whenever you go to a tournament, I think it's really important to start to benchmark yourself to the other student athletes that you see there. And if you're watching the shortstop on another team and you're thinking, wow, she is playing in a different world than I am, and you find out that she's committed to Oklahoma, or you find out she's committed to Williams, whatever the case may be, you can use that as kind of a benchmark to help say, okay, she's in a different world, or I'm roughly same as this. I think I roughly calibrate out to the same as this other girl who I think is committed to X, Y, or Z school. You can start to build a sense of where you might fall. That requires a very honest and open self-evaluation, and also some very candid conversations with coaches, with advisors, with people who are able to care about you and love you enough to say, look, here is where you shake out. Because ultimately, I think that one fault that can come from caring too much or just being too positive is travel coaches, advisors don't necessarily want to say, look, you're not good enough for X, but let me tell you about all the great things that can happen at Y. And I think that having advisors and coaches around you who care about you enough to give you an honest self-assessment, even the parts that might be a little bit painful at the time, is really, really important to help you kind of calibrate your record on where your softball fit might be and where you should be setting your sights on the athletic side. And then finally as well, every conversation that you have with a college coach is going to have, essentially, if you really boil it down and make it simple, 3 different outcomes. They could say, yes, I want you to come to my program. They could say, no, thanks, I think you're a great person, but you're not the fit for us. Or they could say, maybe I need to see you play again. I need to see other players play, whatever the case may be. Every single one of these interactions contains information that you can use to learn. If you talk to the Lafayette coach and you're talking to her and you say, I'm really interested in Lafayette, and the coach says, look, I think you're good enough to play in the Patriot League, but you're not the right fit culture-wise for Lafayette, or I'm not recruiting your position, or there's X, Y, and Z that doesn't make you a fit for our program in particular. If you get that kind of no, one thing you've learned is, okay, I can't go to Lafayette, but maybe I do take a look at Lehigh, similar level of softball. Maybe I learned that this level of softball could be the right fit for me, but this program itself, maybe isn't. Or maybe it's, look, I don't think that you have a home at Duke or in the ACC. Okay, now maybe I need to recalibrate and look at softball that's a little bit less high soaring than the ACC. So every single one of these interactions with college coaches that you're able to have is really useful, not just in expressing your interest to the programs you're interested in, being proactive, and being very engaged in the process personally, but also as a learning experience to take you forward to the next step that you see in building your target list as well. All right, next up, we're going to talk about we've talked about kind of the high academic recruiting process. Now I want to talk about, all right, what do we mean when we say this, and what's unique about this process? When we talk about the high academic recruiting process, we are not referring to, just some of the schools that we've mentioned, just the Ivy League, just the NESCAC, just the Patriot League. We're not talking about the U.S. News and World Report's top 25 or top 50 or top 100. What we're talking about when we talk about high academic recruiting and student athletes who are going through the high academic recruiting process, we're talking about student athletes who are going through the recruiting process with the side-by-side goals of maximizing the academics at the next level and maximizing their softball at the next level. So it's these kind of side-by-side goals of academics and softball that kind of coalesce into this ultimate goal of finding and maximizing holistic fit. Not just softball, not just the classroom, but how do I put these two things together? And it is unique, and it's more difficult, and you're doing this process in a way that a lot of your teammates probably aren't, right? I'm sure that we all had teammates. I'm sure a lot of you on this webinar have teammates who went through this process and said, look, first school that offers me a 50% softball scholarship, I'm saying yes. I don't care where it is. I don't care what the school is. That's what I'm focused on. And that's completely fine. That is absolutely one way to go through the recruiting process. That's not how you all are going through this process, though. You're trying to kind of combine that softball outcome with the academic outcome. And that is a unique process. It has unique needs. One of them is targeted recruiting exposure. The same tournaments that you might be able to get a commit to Oklahoma because a girl's throwing 72 with a nasty drop, that might not be the right tournament to go to if you're targeting Georgetown or Amherst, because Georgetown and Amherst, as much as their coaches would love to have the same recruiting budget as Oklahoma, they probably don't. And so they're a little bit more limited sometimes in the ways that they're able to see student athletes who are the right fit for their programs. And so being where these coaches are is kind of an obvious first step. The other thing is that if Coach Pat from Georgetown is at that massive, she's at the Sparkler and she sees that girl throwing 72, that's great. She might really like her. She then needs to learn a lot more academically about that player before she's able to say, yep, she's coming to be my pitcher for the next 4 years. So just as you need to be efficient, these coaches also need to be efficient, which is why they were able to kind of group them up at our camps, is because they know that over a 2-day period, they're going to see a whole bunch of student athletes who have the grades and have the softball to be playing in a lot of their programs. And your process is unique by virtue of going through it with these side-by-side goals and by virtue of the schools that you are targeting. And your process will be different and more challenging and have unique stumbling blocks and learning opportunities and points of failure than a lot of your peers. And the high academic process it's more challenging. I'm not going to lie, it's more difficult at times. There are unique pain points, but ultimately it is worth it. At least I think, having gone through it. I've spoken with Bonnie. I think she backs me up on this. She also thinks that it's ultimately worth it.
Yes.
Regardless of the outcome, you are going to engage with this process more fully and more completely because you're considering not just the softball, like some of your teammates, or not just the academics, like your chemistry lab partner. You're thinking about schools more critically and more holistically, which ultimately, as you go through this process, is going to help you ask more better questions about your college experience to set you up for a better holistic fit once you enroll in college, wherever that may be. Bonnie, anything to add there about kind of this high academic recruiting process to frame that up for folks?
Sure. Two side notes of it. One is class of 22, 23, 24, whatever you may be, you're still in good position. It's a long process. We're going to talk about that a little bit going further, but it is I won't say it's longer, it's slower. It's slower, and it is a more full 3.5 year, process in terms of your relation to high school. So it is slower in that regard. The other part about it being unique is, of course, that yes, you're going to have different goals than what your friends or your classmates may be going through. And with that, though, you're going to end up with the fit and the feel, because you've done a lot more homework and a lot more legwork by truly getting to places, talking to coaches, developing relationships. You will be able to make that decision saying, yeah, I've turned over every stone. This is exactly where I want to be. And it is different for everyone. I mean, again, it's really different. I have worked with about 3-4 kids out of the Houston and Dallas area. They all want to go somewhere cold because they're tired of the Texas heat. They don't want anything to do with it. 2 are in Chicago and 1's in Boston, and that's just kind of okay. That's pretty unique. Just so it's a little bit different for everybody, but that's part of the joy for me of working with each student and helping them tap what is it that clicks for them, and just exposing them to a lot of different types of universities so they can find the one that clicks.
Absolutely. And I think that the other thing that we'll touch on a little bit as well is kind of, because you're going through this high academic process with softball as a piece of the picture, let's be candid, some of the most competitive admission schools in the world, there's a really kind of beneficial way where they both kind of help each other, where you can leverage softball in a very competitive admissions process in a way that, that other people can't. And there's kind of a way to kind of make these two things play off each other, to use softball to get the best holistic experience at the next level, and kind of have those two things reinforce each other as well. And Bonnie, next up, we're going to talk about kind of the high academic recruiting process and the timing. So I'd love for you to expound on that that timeline, and then how those kind of academics and athletics play into each other in this process as well.
Mm-hmm. Sure. So the ground level of many of the high academics, and what do we call high academic, is roughly, you're looking at schools that have an admissions acceptance rate between 5 and 10% up to 25%. Those are still very, it's a broad swath of schools that are difficult to get into. So what most of these schools require is a full 3-year transcript. They've got to see all your grades through junior year and your best test scores. So yes, they'll track a student starting her sophomore year or the summer after her sophomore year, and they'll look and keep in contact, but there's not, I have not yet heard of any Ivy League or NESCAC, Liberty, anybody that's within this cadre that we work with that, September 1 of junior year, that an offer is made, a scholarship offer, because they can start talking to them. It's nearly impossible because they've only had 2 years of high school. So that's why it's slower. And honestly, I just got a note from one of my students who has been writing the school and never getting any answer back. And now, February 1st, got an answer, said, oh yeah, I'm just now finished with class of 21, so I'm really starting on class of 22. And that is not uncommon. It's painful. It's painful for the 21s. They were waiting all summer, they were waiting all fall. It's painful. But I said, it's just not your turn yet. And then when it's your turn, now you guys get the full focus as class of 22. So if you're behind, you're class of 23, 24, just know that there is a very predictable cycle to it.
And I think to kind of illustrate that, it would be really, really, really difficult for Coach Teague at Columbia to say, hey, admissions liaison, here's my recruiting class. And the admissions liaison opens the folder and it's a bunch of, 2-year transcripts. She says, look, that's great that you like them in the softball field. Right now, I'm looking at 2 years of high school with no test scores. It's really tough for me from an admissions standpoint at a highly competitive school like Columbia to be able to say, yep, they're in. And so to your point, Bonnie, a lot of times they do, yes, they're interested in those 2-year transcripts, but they really need a kind of more full dossier. There's kind of this inverse relationship between the more pull that a school has in admissions. Like if you're a Power 5 softball programs, you're able to, and you're in the top 25, you have a lot of pull in admissions. You think about some of those really big time college softball programs, they have pull in admissions and they can move earlier because they can look at a 2-year transcript and say, this is who I want, let's work with it. But there's an inverse relationship between kind of the competitiveness and how early they might be able to move in a lot of cases. Bonnie, could you touch on kind of the academics and kind of some things that you've heard, like some misperceptions in the space or some common perceptions in the space about the role of academics playing into the recruiting process at these schools?
Mm-hmm. Well, to begin there, as Max mentioned earlier, the goal is taking, your daughter, your child's, her love and passion for softball and matching it with her academic pursuit and using that leverage. So what does that mean, leverage? And so obviously, the higher your GPA, the much more easy it will be for Coach Teague to walk that over to admissions and say, okay, here's what we have. But it doesn't have to be, everybody doesn't have to be a 4.0 and a 36 or a 1600. There, at most schools, there is a gradation, that's the right word, or gradient of these scores. So you can have a 3.5 and a whatever, 14 something, 29, 32. I mean, I'm just throwing some numbers out there. You can have less than perfect. You can be less than perfect and still be a high level recruit and be recruited into a school because these schools have designated slots. They're kind of like golden tickets. There was a lot of news about this a couple of years ago of some people who were not actually really athletes and how parents were paying for those spots. We've all gotten over that. But the long and the short of it is, the better that your academics are, the more doors that can stay open and the more that you can walk up to doors and say, hey, I'm here. And that is the one thing that's in your control as a student athlete, is giving your best effort and taking a progressively challenging course load from sophomore year to junior year. The schools definitely want to see a progression that you're taking. Doesn't have to be every hardest course, but it's got to have some advancement going into that junior year.
And I think that one thing as well is that I often hear from college coaches is I think that there's a perception among student athletes sometimes that every one of their student athletes in a given recruiting class has to be X, whatever they're targeting for their academics. They say you have to have a 3.8 and a 1440, whatever the case may be. And so they're thinking, okay, every student athlete in the class has to have that. When in fact, a lot of these schools are actually kind of viewing the class as a whole. They're thinking about the whole admitted class, and then within that, they're thinking about the subset of what do the admitted student athletes look like? They're thinking about what do the admitted softball players look like? They're thinking, what does this freshman class look like? And they're kind of building a cadre around that. And so oftentimes when coaches talk about their academic targets, whatever they are, depending on the school, they're thinking about what does my whole class have to kind of balance out to? It might mean that if I really, really like this girl, but her ACT is just a little bit lower than I want it to be, I'm targeting a 30 ACT and she is a 28, it might mean at a given school that I can get that player in, but it means that I might need to balance that out with a 33 somewhere else. And so kind of thinking about this from a class as a whole, as Bonnie mentioned, the key part here is the thing that you can control. You can't control how a coach is going to balance you out in their recruiting class. You just need to keep getting after it in the classroom and getting the best grades that you can, showing growth, challenging yourself with your courses in an appropriate way. And then if you are targeting schools that do require standardized tests, putting in the legwork to prep for those and really max out your score on whichever one of those might serve you best, whether that's ACT, SAT, whatever the case may be. I think that one interesting thing over the last year, given limited access to standardized testing, is more schools have gone test optional. And we'll see if that sticks around. I mean, I think that a lot of high academic schools had been kind of eyeballing going test optional. And if you look at some of the NESCAC schools, some of the Ivy League schools, I think that they wanted to go test optional, and this kind of finally gave them the impetus to do so. Whether or not that changes after some of these waivers through 2023 remains to be seen. But I think that maximizing everywhere you can is going to keep the most doors open and put you in control of everything that you can be. Bonnie, how about the role and importance of athletics? You mentioned varsity blues, for example. It's clear that athletics plays a role in the admissions process.
Yeah.
What does that look like at different programs?
Sure, it does. And thank you for, you set it up by giving a visual of exactly what universities are doing and in terms of how they want to diversify the student body, but also have successful athletic teams. And generally speaking, in the schools that we're looking at, a coach will have a designated number of spots or slots, which we were referencing. And with that graded scale, the coach can say, okay, this is my number one choice, and this is my number two, and my number three. So as the recruiting process goes along, I mean, again, when you're getting to know someone, it's a multi-step interview. This is a multi-step, multi-touch interview that's going on long term. Think of, for parents, just think of the longest job interview you've ever been through, and then like times 3. So it's a multi-touch thing. And then as we get into the summertime, the coach will say, yes, okay, you like us and we like you, and we're a good fit. Your transcript is great. Boom. So this means it is virtually a guaranteed spot that if coach from school X says, yes, we are offering you admissions support, that means you are going to be admitted by way of the softball program, and provided again, then through your senior year that you don't commit a felony or have a social media, fall on your face, the student will be attending based on softball, being able to get them in. And again, at a place that is incredibly hard to get into to begin with. So it is an avenue where the coach has direct relationships with admissions, they have direct relationships with financial aid, and that is another, so it's different at every school. Again, some schools it's, yes, for sure, we know that we're going to be able to admit you through a softball recruit or a softball slot. A lot of people ask me, well, how are the scholarships in the Ivy Leagues? And the answer is they are non-existent. There are no athletic scholarships in the Ivy League. So what they have to offer is the opportunity to attend and to be admitted to school. So that's a combination of parents' ability to pay and financial aid. And again, coaches are liaisons. You get to some of the other Patriot League schools, for example, they are Division I, but as a choice, the Patriot League has chosen not to fully fund softball and among other sports. It's just they're still playing at Division I, but they are modifying how much they spend on scholarships. So a coach may give a portion of a scholarship, or you may be admissible on your own in one of these Patriot League schools, and your parents fortunately have the ability to pay. Parents, you have the ability to pay. That's also an avenue where the coach can say, okay, we like this student. We're not giving her any particular money at the point, but admissions, we really want her on our team. Is she admissible? So there's those varying levels of support. And it may be some soft support as well. And then the final piece I would put in there is talking about, okay, how about financial aid? Again, coaches have different amounts of, I won't say influence, but just the transparency about how a student's profile typically is rewarded or awarded financial aid. And that might be, again, grant money, you don't have to pay back, merit money, scholarship money, all of that are things that you do not have to pay back. It's being funded by the university. And again, example, recent student from this past class got her match to her number one, and parents were kind of crossing their fingers, and it ended up that the university offered to pay 80% because she was that high up in terms of her GPA, her SAT, and where she fell in the softball line. So that was a pretty good outcome for that student and that family. It was a long haul, and the last month was grueling, but a lot worked out in the end.
Fantastic. Next up, we're going to roll into the kind of what changes have come about. Sorry, my phone is ringing. I apologize if you can hear that. What's changed over the last year or so with COVID, given the ongoing dead period, et cetera? And to kind of kick this off, I want to talk about the quote unquote new tools of recruiting. Without in-person recruiting at all for Division I, and with limited, depending on the school, depending on coach's comfort, in-person recruiting for other divisions over the really since last April is when they dropped this dead period, there's been a lot more heavy emphasis on video, recruiting and showcase video, live game footage, all this stuff that you can equip college coaches with to get a sense of who you are as a player. Now you see pretty quickly from this why I put new in quotes. Video is not a new tool to the recruiting process. Coaches have been using video for years. I mean, I'm borderline dinosaur, but I remember putting DVDs, imagine this, putting DVDs in the mail to programs that I was interested in, sending them my recruiting video once upon a time. Before that, it was VHS, I heard. I was just on the cusp where I got into DVD.
I was going to say, well, I had a stack of VHS in the office. I'd bring them home so I could tape my shows, and I had to recycle them. We had lots of that.
And so video is not new in this process, but its kind of centrality and primacy in the recruiting process it's kind of a refocus on this tool that has always existed. Previously, coaches they wanted to see video, but the role of it was a bit more limited because coaches wanted to see video, but they also wanted to get to see you play in person so they could get live eyeballs on you to kind of verify what they were seeing on video. Without those live eyeballs, without the opportunity to see you play live at tournaments or at showcases or at college-specific prospect camps, they had to put more and more emphasis on video, on more regular video, more video. Instead of sending a video once every 6 months, maybe you now need to send video to coaches once every couple weeks to kind of update them. But I think that coaches, the point of this is coaches do still need to get as comfortable a sense of who you are as a player as they did before. Just because they weren't able to see you play live doesn't mean that they're like, yeah, you know, she's probably good enough, I'll commit her. They still want to get to know you as much as possible as a player, and they're using video more and more to do that. Bonnie, when you think about kind of video, what are some of the things that, and video in recruiting, what are some of the things that you talk about with your student athletes about how to effectively leverage video now that it is such a primary focus?
Mhm. So to begin with, it should be simple as using an iPhone or an iPad and a family member to help hold it steady and take some things. There's not a need to have a grand production, and you don't have time because that's going to slow you down to have someone come film it and then process it and yeah. You can go do your things and be very, very efficient. I had students this summer that were hitting batting practice in their backyards and the dog was chasing them. That became very entertaining. So my advice for clips in video now is more frequent, but very short. 1 minute, no more than 2 minutes, right? We all have the attention spans of a gnat and we all are tired. It's been a long year. We're tired emotionally, physically, all of those things. So keep it short, keep it more frequent. It should highlight what you're the best at. If you hit bombs, then you should be taking a lot of BP from the side and from the behind the catcher, so we can see all those bombs going out. If you've got speed for days, then you should be adding, home to first times, home to home, or live, home to first, live, home to home, live, second to home. Show your wheels in softball action. If you got hands like butter, they would say, got hands like butter, then show us what you have. And athleticism. And I'm going to throw in one other piece that I have been using with my students, is really successful, is throw in a video that is about non-athletic stuff. Show your artwork, show your I have a student who does glass blowing, a student who is did a major project, a relay for life. She was the chairperson for that, so she did some it's got to be more about who you are, who your children are as people, because coaches want to know that. And right now they can't get any feel for that at all. We went long stretches where they couldn't, but this is another way to be helpful. And the reason that the coaches want to know about your children and what they're like is, bus rides are long. And we spend a lot of time together. It is a long way from Cornell to Princeton. It's a long bus ride. It's 6.5 hours sometimes. It is a long way from Princeton to Dartmouth. It's a long way to Bowdoin and Bates and so on. So it's that sense of what makes this kid tick beyond just any softball related things. And again, I think keeping it short and realizing that coaches are looking at a lot of the same stuff. So if you can do this in a unique area, and maybe also make sure your daughter speaks on this video, because there's also a lot that, okay, we're in the cage, we're in the facility, we see the swings, we see the this, we see the that, but we don't hear anything from this student. At least put, hi, my name's Bonnie, I'm class of 21, and I'm a shortstop. I also play outfield. Boom. Thanks for watching my video. That should go on every video, something that's personalized.
Two things that I want to kind of pick out and really double down on. One is, before the existence of YouTube and iPhones, I think that this pandemic would have been way, way worse on the recruiting standpoint. I think that having tools like YouTube and Sports Recruits, which is just a really easy recruiting profile that you can build up and upload video to, you don't have to, every time you go out and film a video, as Bonnie said, it does not need to be a professional affair. You don't need to call in the film crew from Prodigal Son to make sure that it looks nice and is lit correctly, right? It's mom, dad, brother, sister, aunt, uncle, coach, whoever is around with an iPhone or a smartphone. If you have a tripod, great, just so it's not wiggling, but just holding it as steady as you can and getting that footage, getting it frequently, and getting it frequently means limiting some of those barriers to entry. The other thing is, every time you get this video, you don't need to go out and burn another DVD or record it onto a new VHS and record over some home video from 10 years ago, right? Upload it to YouTube, upload it to your recruiting profile on Sports Recruits and cut it together. It's really, really easy now to frequently update these videos and get them in coaches' hands with very little technical knowledge. You don't have to be a cinematographer to film this or to edit it with the tools that now exist. So I think that leveraging that and really using those tools and this newish technology to your advantage. The other thing is that Bonnie mentioned is organizing your recruiting video to highlight your strengths. If you're a slapper, or you're a speed demon, don't start your video with you trying to hit home runs. Start it with your home to first. Start it with that nasty bunt that you laid down in a tournament last week. Tailor your video and start with the things that really can grab some eyeballs, right? If you're a power hitter, start with that view from behind your BP where you're just mashing bombs. Start there, and then maybe later on you show home to first because you know you have to, but it's not your strength, right? So kind of present the information, organize it in a way that highlights your strengths and tailor it to those strengths. If it's that you have an absolute cannon, start with your defensive video. You know, if you have great hands, start there. Start with your reps at shortstop with a close-up. Put some of them in slow motion just to kind of show how nice that transfer is, or whatever the case may be.
I'm gonna jump in
next up. Oh yeah.
Oh, sorry, just one last piece on that about the video. This summer, when there were places where games were going on and tournaments were going on, I was incredibly impressed with how nimble the travel teams were to live stream their games, not even relying on a tournament, but just individual teams. Athletes go live, became a very active site. These coaches, you know, were itching to get out, and they couldn't, but they could watch you live. So we had a lot of students send their links, and they could see, okay, Middlebury has checked in to watch the game. Well, they could see Georgetown has checked in to watch the game, and coaches were tweeting about that. They'd kind of show their computer sitting on their back porch and saying, okay, I'm going to recruit right now. If that is something that's needed, it's a tool that that is out there and is successful and was a really good lifeline. It was a really good lifeboat during this time. So we know that it's there if it's something that's needed in the future.
Absolutely. It's also why, quite honestly, at Head First, it's why we film all the game footage and send that to coaches as well. We film the defensive showcase. This year, we filmed the offensive showcase. We filmed the pitching showcase, just gathering as much video as possible in those instances where it, you know, in some instances where it can be verified or can be live game footage, which is harder to capture with the iPhone with mom and dad. But just getting video at every chance you can. Next up, and Champani, you spoke to this a little bit already, but I call this kind of email plus because there are tools now. Email is still really important, obviously, in the recruiting process, but there are also tools that go beyond that. And as you mentioned, coaches still want to and need to know you as a whole person before they say, yep, I'm going to spend 60 hours a week with you in a locker room and in a dugout. They still want to get to know you. And so I think that there's an importance to bolstering typical email communication, you know, sending the video and sending your updated transcript and checking in on their season or whatever it is, bolstering that email communication with other avenues. Zoom if it's appropriate, texting if you've built that relationship with coaches, you know, giving their program a follow and some comments on social media. If Princeton tweets that they just won the big weekend series at Harvard, great, you know what, go on and comment on that or reply to it or whatever the case may be. Because coaches do absolutely still need to know that you're the right character and culture fit for their program. As Bonnie said, for me, the ride from Amherst to Hamilton was not short and it was not a super picturesque one. And so getting to know your teammates and knowing the culture fit between coaches and the players on the roster was so important as coaches go through the recruiting process. So kind of using other touch points beyond just email, as Bonnie mentioned, using video and using email and using these other platforms to communicate, not just here's who I am on paper in the classroom and here's who I am on video on the field. What are my other interests? You know, what are my extracurriculars? What are the clubs that I'm spearheading? What are the projects I've taken on just for fun? What's my quarantine hobby? If you took up sourdough bread baking in the last 10 months, maybe that's cool. Maybe a coach also did. And it's kind of this touch point that can really humanize and personalize you. Because I think that without these touch points that go beyond just the academics or just the softball, there's something lacking in terms of personalization and really humanizing who you are beyond just, yes, I could be your next shortstop or not, and I have the grades or not, but also, am I the right fit for your program? Am I the right fit culturally, character-wise for you and for the other girls that are in that program? Bonnie, anything to add there or from what you said earlier? Or?
I think we've covered that.
Cool. And then also another kind of piece that that I think softball coaches started to move towards, and certainly are still moving in this direction, is using more and more, going hand in hand with data, or sorry, going hand in hand with video, is using more data and analytics, using tools like Blast or Rapsodo or HitTrax, whatever it may be that they have access to in their programs, and also objective measurements. You know, we mentioned home to first on video, also with the stopwatch, throwing velocity with the pocket radar, batted ball velocity, whatever data points you're able to communicate in addition to the video, I think can really help coaches get a sense of, okay, here's your max output, right? If they see you hitting BP, that's great. They're gonna look at their mechanics, they're gonna see how your swing works. If you then pair that with, here's my batted ball velocity, they can say, okay, here is max output. Here is the output that I see off the bat here. And I can look at the video to get a sense of the mechanics and how she generates this power. And so giving them these different data points can certainly help them just get a sense of what are your objectives? What is your max output? How fast are you on your best day? Next up is what's the same. So we talked about kind of what was different, right? More reliance on video, more reliance on email. Some coaches got really creative and were doing Zoom tours of campus, which was really cool to see for some of their prospective student athletes. What's the same? As much as kind of the tactics of recruiting had to change and adapt over the last 10 months since the dead period dropped, there's been a lot that's stayed the same as well. And I think that that's really important, because I think that the guideposts and some of the really key principles for high academic recruiting didn't change, right? The end goal is still to maximize your fit, your academic, and your athletic outcome. The principles for finding the right school for you and getting access to that program didn't really change, right? You're still looking for the same thing, which is the best college experience and leveraging softball to work this in the college experience. That hasn't changed. To do that, you still need efficient targeted exposure, whether that's via live stream or video that you film with mom and dad or head first showcases or whatever it is. You still need efficient targeted exposure, especially for high academic student athletes who are going through this with such a unique list of schools oftentimes. And you still need to be proactive in the process. I think that one difficult thing that I saw from a lot of conversations that I had with student athletes over the last 10 months, but certainly front loaded to kind of March, April, May, June of last year, was it was really tough to be proactive. I think that a lot of student athletes, when they heard the dead period drop, when a lot of their high school or they saw college seasons, like they see these seasons get canceled, there was a pause that hit a lot of student athletes who are going through the recruiting process. But I think that one key thing that has not changed, that's just a little bit harder now, is that student athletes who are going through this still need to be proactive however they can, whether that means getting out every 2 weeks and getting access and filming some new video to update your sports recruits profile, getting on campus in a formal or informal way or a digital way. If there are some schools that are doing, 3D or Zoom admissions panels and campus tours. So being proactive in the process is so important. If there was a magic bullet in the recruiting process, I would go off on my own for a business and I would make a ton of money, right? There is no magic bullet in the recruiting process, but the closest thing to it is being proactive. It doesn't guarantee that you're going to end up exactly where you want to be, but it gives you the best chance, right? You can't sit back and wait. No matter what the circumstances are around you, it's still important that you work within them to, like, with whatever the restrictions are. Maybe it's that you're not going to have high school season. Maybe it's that your target schools can't come see you until June 1st or July 1st or next December. What are the constraints? And then how do you take the next one step, the next 2 steps, the next 3 steps, working within those constraints to still be proactive and to still move your recruiting process forward? You can't control everything. I think that one thing that softball teaches a lot of student athletes is control the controllables, right? I'm sure you've heard that before. There's a lot of non-controllables in the recruiting process, especially right now, but it's really important that student athletes be proactive with the things that they can control so that whenever this lifts, whatever your next step is, you're setting yourself up for success once you get there.
Yeah, I would just hit on that for the proactive part and the patience, because it's still long, but it's a long process. For a class of 22. This is still potentially another 8 months or a year, right? So again, one of my student athletes heard from her school, a West Coast school, and said, I'm just finished with class of 21, which means they got students through early admissions and potentially ED2 or their January admissions. That's a year, right? That's an entire year. So this, the reason I say this is I don't want you to get antsy about time, or I can't get to the school, or I don't know, right? We all are waiting for the opportunity to be a little more mobile and get to these places. But honestly, most students don't make their final decision about where they're going to go until the fall of their senior year. They always double back for one more in-person visit, typically a very softball directed visit, an overnight, and go to class with kids. That doesn't happen until fall of senior year anyways. So we have a long way to go. And I just want you to keep that in mind. I have your daughters keep that in mind, that it's okay. It's February, and come September, we're going to have some more flexibility. And that is really when the senior class is going to be making their decisions, starting late August through early decision, and then maybe even a little bit beyond into early decision 2, which is in January.
And one question actually kind of just came in about this as well, so it's pretty good timing. A few notes, we talked about kind of the importance of being proactive. One of the areas that I think is really important to be super proactive is in coach communication. And so here we just outlined a handful of cheat codes that I would put out there in terms of managing effective communication. The most important one is to personalize every touch point. For me, it's about balancing research versus curiosity. Don't ask coaches a question about their school or program that you can easily find online. Don't ask them what their mascot is, right? You can find that really quickly with a quick Google search and a Wikipedia page or the athletics website, whatever it is. Example of things that are super relevant that you can find. You can go onto their roster and you can see oftentimes where every girl on the roster is from, what their hometown is, what their high school is, and what their major is. And so if you're thinking about majoring in civics, government, philosophy, whatever, you go on, you look at their roster and you say, oh, I noticed these 5 girls have the same major that I do. Coach, I've noticed that some girls in your roster are majoring in engineering, which is what I would like to be majoring in. I would love to connect with them or get your thoughts on how they manage that course load in season, right? You can pretty quickly and easily find out what the majors of the players are. You can't necessarily find out that more kind of personal, anecdotal stuff. And so balancing what you're able to find in research and then being curious and asking good and thoughtful questions about the stuff that isn't Googleable, no one's helpless. We all have Google, right? You can find out a lot of this information. The parts that you can't, if you ask some really good questions about it, that can really indicate your interest in the program and really personalize the touch point. Also key, please proofread your emails. And mom and dad, this is where you can be a really important safety valve too. And this means, yes, you want to read it for tone and make sure you didn't put you instead of your, or you put the right your. You don't want to have typos. Also, please make sure it's going to the right email address, has the right coach's name, has the right school name. You wouldn't believe how often I hear from college coaches that they're like, Max, I just got 10 emails from student athletes who said, dear Coach McKenna, I'm really interested in Williams. And I'm thinking, I don't want to go to, I coach at Amherst. You're telling me you want to go to my rival. Why am I going to answer your email? So just kind of double checking all these things and proofreading them. And then also, as we talked about, kind of organizing and presenting your email, your information in a way that highlights your strengths, personalizing every email. One thing that I heard from this was a baseball coach who said this, but I think still relevant. If you aren't getting responses to your email, chances are it's because it's not personalized enough. If it looks like a generic or canned email, coaches are going to be a lot less likely to reply to it. And so inserting 1 or 2 things or 3 things to personalize that each and every touch point, especially those introductory emails, can go a long way in generating a response for them. Now, maybe that response is, thank you for sending your video. I can't talk to you yet. Thank you for sending your video. I'm not interested. But kind of getting that response helps you move forward. Mm-hmm. And what I can really say here is, yeah, go ahead.
So I would just piggyback on that part real quick. I am not the most creative person in the world. So I rely on the young people that I work with is be creative in the subject line. Just something that is going to grab this coach's attention. And oftentimes the girls are like, really? It's kind of, they have to get out of their comfort zone. Like when I've told them to talk about chorus or talk about something they've done, they're nervous, but then when they do it and they're like, coach really liked that. Or one girl was a state level swimmer. And the coach is like, oh, I totally know about swimming because my sister was a swimmer. And I know that means you get up at 5 o'clock in the morning. And I know that means you're really dedicated. So something that she thought was not important about softball actually is really important about softball.
Absolutely.
Find creative lines.
No, absolutely. And I think that a balance between kind of being creative and being interesting with those subjects, but also like trying to keep it fairly short and trying to be somewhat straightforward about what's inside, right? If you're including video in that, say, in the subject line, maybe say video included so that a coach knows that they're not going to just open the email and see boilerplate language. There's something for them to click on and do in it as well. So I think that, experiment. One thing that I do with our marketing content is I A/B test with subject lines. I would do the same thing. If you send one subject line to the Amherst coach and one subject line to the Williams coach, and one of them opens it and replies to your email and the other one doesn't, maybe the next time you email the other coach, you use a subject line. You kind of learn from that experiment. And you want to make sure that you're giving coaches the information that they need to have as well. So it doesn't mean that every email has the same video. It doesn't mean that every email has your transcript, but you need to make sure that, especially in those introductory emails, you're sending them some of the video, you're sending them your academic information that you do have access to, so that they can start to, have a decent picture of what you might look like from the recruiting standpoint. And I think that one other thing about personalizing the emails is not just here's who I am and putting yourself completely out there. That's important, but that's one half of it. I think that the other half is indicating why you're interested in this school. And that's where, if you're emailing Babson and you know that you want to major in business and you want to go to Babson because they have a great entrepreneurial focus in their business program, do that. If you're interested in entrepreneurship, Babson's a great place to go. And if that's why you're interested in Babson, put that in that email. And that can, again, really tell coaches that you have done the research about their program and that you are genuinely interested in their program. That's what personalizing those emails can really do, is really indicate your interest in their program. And then we talked about this a little bit, but non-email touch points as well. Don't be afraid of a handwritten letter. I think that it used to be where, again, I would do typed up or handwritten letters and put a DVD in an envelope and send that to coaches. Now it's all digital. And so I think that sending a handwritten letter every now and then can help you stand out. One perfect time for this is if you come to an honor roll camp and you interact with a coach and you get some great pointers. If you have that positive interaction, send them a handwritten thank you note, because that will really help you stand out. It doesn't mean that you have to do all of your communication by handwritten letter. Don't worry. The bulk of your communication is still going to be email, but I think that mixing it up and doing some kind of either non-traditional or more traditional, depending on how you think about, hard copy mail, doing it in some of that way can help you stand out as well.
I agree with that completely. Yeah. It's like a sales cycle. If you keep sending the same thing, they're just like, oh, here it is again. But if you jazz up the sales cycle, they kind of perk up a little bit.
Absolutely. Now we're going to move into the Q&A, and I do want to make sure we're respecting everybody's time. I know that we're 11 minutes over kind of the promised timeline of 8 p.m. So if you guys has dinner plans or chemistry homework and has to go off to do that, please, I will not be offended if you dip off. We're going to stay with the Q&A for as long as we need to. We've also recorded this session. We'll be sending it out to families that attended as well as families that registered but were unable to attend. So certainly not the only chance that you have to listen to this.
I'm going to jump in and say, okay, you got sending in the question. Max will get you that in a moment. As I mentioned earlier, I want to make sure before people hop off is if you'd like to send your video clips to me for an evaluation, there we go, dcatsoftball@gmail.com. And then I'll take a look at them and give you a call and be in touch with you.
Absolutely. And tonight, tomorrow, certainly not the only chance to get your questions answered by either one of us. And so I'm going to leave this page up on the screen as we go to the Q&A. If you have any questions that come up next week, 3 months from now, in August, feel free to reach out to us at any point. You see our email address there, our phone number. If you want to take a look at some of the blog posts that we've done that cover how to get leverage in the recruiting process, there's some great resources on there as well. Also, feel free to toss us a follow on Twitter and Instagram. I always love seeing those numbers go up. And then you see diamondcollegeadvisory.com, dcatsoftball@gmail.com to contact Bonnie and her team as well. To dive into questions, a couple really good questions came in about standardized testing while we were talking about it. So with board scores becoming more likely to not be required or utilized, depending on the school, as we kind of talked about, what else can student athletes do to stand out from an academic standpoint? Bonnie, you wanna touch on this? I know I have some thoughts, but I'd love to get yours first.
Yeah, sure. Again, I think if a student is in the position that the test scores are in a high percentile, they're still worth presenting. It also might be then changing the shift in the focus towards success in the AP classes and or subject tests. We've got to be able to demonstrate what I always call is being able to demonstrate intellectual curiosity. I used to be a admissions volunteer interviewer in my area, and so that's what I was always trying to uncover for kids is what is stimulating their intellectual curiosity. And so I think that, again, a test can always capture that, and being able to expound on your chemistry projects or what your chemistry lab is going on is an opportunity to do that. Or again, this young lady that ran and organized an entire Relay for Life fundraising program. Like, those are other ways. It's not directly to test scores, but that's kind of my take on how I would pitch it in terms of intellectual curiosity.
Absolutely. I think that intellectual curiosity is absolutely the phrase that I would use. And I think that extracurriculars are a great way to do that. And, that's more and more the case with admissions departments as a whole too. I mean, it's not just coaches that are going to have to deal with at some of these schools the lack of SAT or ACT scores. It's admissions departments, right? And so they're going to place more emphasis on your transcript, right? Not only what's your GPA, what's your course load look like? And when they look at your course load relative to what your school offers, where does it balance in terms of difficulty? So that's going to play more in. Your personal statement, your essay, your extracurriculars, all of those are going to come up a bit more at schools that aren't looking at SAT or standardized test scores anymore. Kind of related to this was another question that came in was, I heard you talk about testing being important to the high academic schools. As a class of 2022 recruit, I'm interested to know if you think there will be as much of an emphasis on tests for upcoming years because of COVID, because of schools going test optional, as we kind of mentioned. This student athlete has already taken her SAT, but she knows that a lot of her classmates haven't. And I think that one thing that's important to touch on is a lot of these schools, as we talked about, are going test optional. At least they did. A lot of them did for this past admission cycle. A lot of them have chosen to through 2022, some of them 2023. Some of them took this opportunity to say, hey, we're test optional forever. I think that being test optional does not mean that you cannot submit an SAT score. And so if you have one, or if you're the type of person, like I was, that you think a standardized test score can help your academic profile, you should still take it if you're able to. Especially for student athletes, coaches, what we're seeing is the upshot of standardized testing is it's not a statement on who you are as a human being, right? It's not this 6 hours sitting in a high school gym doesn't dictate whether you're a good or bad person. But for better or for worse, it is the clearest thing that gives coaches an apples to apples comparison between you academically and some other student athletes that they might be looking at. A 31 on the ACT is a 31 on the ACT, whereas a 3.9 GPA from this school might be a 92 GPA out of a different scale from this school, or a 5+ from this other school. Schools have all sorts of wacky things GPA-wise. They have different course loads. Grade inflation works differently at different high schools, and so all these things play in. Standardized test scores do give coaches and admissions departments an apples to apples view. So even for schools that are test optional, there can be a benefit for student athletes in particular if you have access to these tests to get these numbers so that you can communicate them to coaches. Now, a coach might say, great, that's great to know where you sit. I actually don't need you to submit that, or that's not going to help you, or whatever the case may be. But I think that if you're able to, having these test scores could still help you as a student athlete in a way that other students might not necessarily have to think about, because when they send their application, they're including every bit of it, and it's going directly to the admissions office. When you submit your application, at least early on, you're sending it to a college coach, and it might not be the whole thing, right? You might not have written your college essay yet, but you're sending coaches something for what's called an early read, which is mostly your academic information. If it's just a transcript, that might be great, or it might not necessarily give coaches every piece that they need. So long story short is I think there can still be some benefits, even at test optional schools, for student athletes to take these tests if they're able to, and if it's something that you think is going to benefit. If you're a bad test taker and the test score isn't going to benefit you, then I certainly wouldn't say do it just to do it. But I think there can be benefits just to give coaches a clear, immediate picture of where you are academically.
Mm-hmm.
Bonnie, anything there?
I agree with everything that Max has said, and the piece about also not having to chase it or take it is if it requires you to go out of state or stay overnight, that's not always necessary. Some people have done it. Some people really wanted to do it, but if it's not possible, or that is the only way for you to take the test scores, to take the test and receive a score, just kind of take a beat about that and think and ask some coaches of the schools that you are interested in. Hey, I'm on the fence about this. Do you believe the test score is going to be what kind of factor within admissions this year? It's a great way to, that's a reason to talk to a coach. I mean, and that's a pretty valid reason. It's not just some made up thing, but I just don't want people to, some people just don't have access to it. And you should not be penalized or have to be going above and beyond to get something that's still we don't know exactly how much it's going to weigh in.
Absolutely. And absolutely. I think that the interesting piece that you touched on as well is it's going to vary school by school. It's not going to be the same at Bowdoin as it is at Amherst. Bowdoin was already test optional. Amherst just went test optional. How does that play into it? And so having these conversations with the coaches at the programs that you are interested in is the best way to find out. If you say, like, look, I think an SAT score could help me. I'm looking at these 5 schools. How about I ask these coaches and kind of see what their take on it is? I took a practice test and I got up 1550. Coach Burton, do you think that's going to help me at Bowdoin? Coach Johnson, do you think that's going to help me at Amherst? And kind of get their take on it, because it will vary school by school and coach by coach. And so going straight to the source is going to be the best way to get what is going to be the right information. Bonnie, a question I'm going to toss directly to you is: do coaches, if you started emailing college coaches, do coaches also want, welcome, need phone calls from recruits who have been emailing them, but they haven't yet reached back out to those players? Like, what role do phone calls play in your coach communication plan for coaches that have responded, coaches that haven't, in between?
Yeah, to just make sure we set up the parameters too for those that are in the know or not. So Division I coaches may not make phone contact until September 1 of your junior year. Okay, Division III coaches can call you in 8th grade. Typically they don't, and they really don't even call in sophomore year. So don't worry so much about that. So I'll take the one where, okay, you've been in a sort of a recruiting cycle, or the coaches typically set the pace. So if you're getting some regular phone calls, or you got one from the assistant, and then 2-3 weeks later, or a month later, the head coach wants to set one up, a call, a Zoom, what have you. The coaches typically set the pace for the calls, the live calls. If you're on a pace and then something happens and they go radio silent, that is an opportunity for you to let a little time go, maybe look at their schedule, see if they're on spring break, see what's happening at their school. Once they start their seasons, they're very, very busy. And quite honestly, April 1st, communication stops, it drops off a lot. because they're playing and you're playing, and it's not going to pick back up again until June. So typically they set that pace. But if you get a big gap, it's okay. Again, I call it an excuse. Find an excuse to email them and or ask for a conversation. It depends where you are in the recruiting process or the recruiting cycle with them. If you're heading towards summer before senior year, and you're starting to narrow your list, you've got your top 5, you're making some decisions, and you need to know, hey, am I still in the picture at Hamilton? When Hamilton, we had a lot of contact and then they went away, there's a way to appropriate way to jumpstart that. The other piece where you asked about what do you do if you've never been called, and I've had this situation with a couple other students. Again, if you're in your junior year and you're able to speak with these coaches, then I think it's really, I've had some students successfully, and I do advise them to ask for the phone call. And I might start with an assistant coach, because sometimes assistants they're kind of the first filter in the recruiting process, or they're just trying to balance everybody. Just to remember that coaches are recruiting actively recruiting 5 students for every one that they're really going to get. So you're looking at 10 or 12 schools, and they might be looking at 10 pitchers and have a list, but they have their top 5. So just remember that there's a lot of people in the mix, and if there's information or contact that you want to make and it's not happening, it's okay for you to initiate that. It's absolutely okay, because they're either going to say yes, no, or maybe, right? And that's going to give you a lot of information. To sort of get your feet wet, direct it towards the assistant coach. They're usually very warm and fuzzy. Not that head coaches are not, but assistants, it's just a different role. It's a different role in life. So just pitch it out there. Hey, coach, and have something specific. I would like to ask about this. I'm very interested in Boston University because, and I just would like to know a little bit more about where I may fit as a softball recruit.
Absolutely, and I think that for lack of a better word, I would call this to some degree like, when do you cold call a coach, right? Like when you've been sending a couple emails, you haven't heard back. I don't think that the timing for a cold call is like, well, I sent one email and they didn't reply, I'm going to pick up the phone and give them a call. I think that there's a couple kind of intermediate steps, Try them again over email, try them a couple times over email, try a different platform. But there does come a time in the recruiting process where if you haven't gotten that yes, no, or maybe from some of your top choice programs, there is a time, and it's usually like August, September of maybe October into November of your senior year, where you need those answers. And so I think it's completely appropriate to pick up the phone and say, Coach, I know you haven't replied to an email from me since last June. You're at the top of my list. I just wanted to ask. I wanted to chat. But I think that, trying to say, hey, Coach, here's an email. Could we hop on the phone is generally going to be the best way to kind of respect their time and their preference. Because a lot of things, assistant coaches and head coaches are all warm and fuzzy. I think they're all wonderful, wonderful human beings to be working with. And I'm really happy that we get to. They all have different communication preferences as well. Some of them, you're going to send them an email and they're going to give you a call and say, hey, I actually don't really like email. I just want to talk on the phone. Others are never going to want to talk on the phone with you, and they're going to say, hey, can you text me or whatever, or let's stick to email. So I think that kind of on a one-off basis, and with as you learn more about each coach that you're communicating with, and as you kind of start to build the rapport and build the relationship, understanding what their communication preferences are. Are they a texting coach? Are they a phone call coach? Are they a call you weekly coach? Are they an email coach? All these different things, and kind of meeting them where they are as well.
Yeah. One other button up on that would be, if as a student athlete, if you've had multiple touches, you've had 3, 4, 5 reach outs to them, that's also a good time to utilize your travel coach, whether they have a relationship or not. Many of them do have relationships with lots of universities, and it doesn't matter if they don't, but it's another person who is a third party. They're biased towards you. They're gonna talk you up, as they should. And they also can talk about your character, and they can talk about how you work within the team and what you bring to the team. And that call to a coach is another way to kind of potentially get the juices flowing.
Next question, Bonnie, that I'll turn to you first is, we've talked about kind of like great grad year agnostic for most of this, but I think we turned most specifically towards 2022s. Could you please touch base on 2023 grads? What should a 2023 grad be focusing on right now in their recruiting process?
Mm-hmm. So 2023 grad, being in their sophomore year, would be really concentrating on a strong foundation in the classroom. I mean, we can't say it enough, is you've got to have that strong base so that as you step into junior year, you know, you're not trying to pull a GPA up. I mean, once GPAs are, if you get down and you get below that 3 number, you get below 3.5, whatever it may be, it's much harder to influence that. So now as a sophomore is the time to stay on top of it. That's point number 1 for sure. The second point I would say is you may make outreaches and you may make updates to coaches, but I would have it less frequently, like once every month, every 2 months. You know, you don't have to be on some very regimented process because you're going to run out of things to say. It's a long thing, but be able to say, okay, hey, send your high school schedule, send your travel schedule this summer. And then when you have some great gains or some obvious improvements in your skill, your speed, your power, your strength, when you're able to show that and demonstrate that, that's another way to touch point. Again, maybe once a quarter. So that's a good thing to be doing as a sophomore. And then also, obviously, just trying to get a little feel for researching the schools. Sophomores can go on these virtual tours, the admission webinars. I highly, highly recommend that. Just to start getting, well, I think I really like UCLA. Okay, well, go on the webinar. And that's a talking point later. Hey, coach, I went on the admissions webinar and I just am bowled over and blah, blah, blah. You know, so they know that you have some really genuine interest and that you've done some homework for that.
I think it can never be too early to start school research and to start to build out kind of with broad strokes what your school list might look like and doing the research to get there. I think that when you get to the meat of the recruiting process, having a foundation of if you get an email from the Union softball coach, having an idea of who Union is and where it is and what it's like in Schenectady will help you. Now you can do that research then too, but I think that having a foundation of that research of different schools and programs, and also having a sense of here's the broad swim lane that I'm heading for academically and athletically, and some of those qualities that we mentioned earlier, if you have kind of some broad strokes of that, then you can be more efficient with your exposure as well. The other piece that I would add to Bonnie's response, and I think that those were all perfect points, get better at softball too. I think that, you know, that's a constant, you know, top of the priority list is always getting better at softball. But I think that, you know, before coaches can interact with you directly, before they can talk recruiting specifics with you, it's always a great time to keep getting better and keep raising your ceiling so that more coaches, once the time comes, can be interested in you. And to the point about kind of still setting them some regular or semi-regular updates with video and your academics and whatever it is that you have, maintaining a line of communication, it's important to understand that communication will be one-sided for now. When Max McKenna, current sophomore, sends an email to a Division I coach, I am going to get back a templated boilerplate email that says, Max, thank you for your email. Here's our list for our summer or fall on-campus camps. I can't talk to you because you're, you know, class of 2023. That's perfectly fine. That doesn't mean that you shouldn't update them with the video. It doesn't mean that you shouldn't send them these updates when you have important updates or reasons to contact, as Bonnie mentioned. But, you know, it's also important to not get disheartened when you get that email saying, thank you, non-response or kind of, you know, copy and paste language, because that's what, by the rules of the NCAA, that's what those Division I coaches have to send. But I think that, you know, being proactive, being persistent, but also being patient is kind of threading that needle as a sophomore can be really frustrating and can be challenging, but it is really important as you also stay after it in the classroom, stay after it on the field, because you want to make sure that both of those things are as high as possible so that every door possible is open to you once you hit the ground really hard with the recruiting.
You have to pace yourself mentally and emotionally. And it's like what we've been doing since last March. You know, this is not a sprint, and the recruiting process is not a sprint. And you're going to have highs and lows, but again, just really emotionally, as Max was explaining, saying, okay, we can't be too attached to getting a response spring of sophomore year. You know, they're going to come later. As I said, you're going to have to wait your turn. You're getting yourself in line, and you're doing a lot of things to be ready when your turn in line comes. But it's also helping you identify some places, but just pace yourself.
And I think that, you know, the other area in terms of coach communication and video, the other place that I think it's impossible to be overly proactive is in getting some of this exposure to these college coaches as well. You know, we have a lot of sophomores and even freshmen, you know, rising freshmen, rising sophomores, rising juniors come to our camps each and every summer. And they're not going to walk away from camp with a commitment, right? They can't walk up to Coach Allard from Harvard and say, hey, I'm coming to Harvard. And she says, yep, I'll see you in 2 years. That's not how that's going to work at Division I programs because they can't talk recruiting specifics. But what you are doing, as Bonnie mentioned, is you're putting themselves on their radar. Or sorry, you're putting yourself on their radar. They are a college coach at Division I program. Just because they can't talk to sophomores or they can't talk to ninth graders doesn't mean that they aren't looking for and recruiting them. It's just more of a passive interaction, right? They're not saying that's my next shortstop. I'm going to go talk to her about her scholarship offer. They're saying, I really like that shortstop. I'm going to put her name on the list of sophomores that I'm going to follow for later. So you're still getting on their radars by getting exposure opportunities to them. The other interesting or unique thing about our camps as well is that because we are, you know, an instructional camp in the eyes of the NCAA, whereas at a tournament, sophomores cannot interact with college coaches. At our camp, they can. They still can't talk about their scholarship offer or their spot on the roster, but you have the chance to have a face-to-face conversation with Coach Allard and say, I'm really interested in Harvard. I'd love to learn more. And she can talk in generalities about, you know, giving you instruction on your play at shortstop or giving you instruction at your play at the plate, and talk generalities about her school and her program. So it is kind of one of the few places before September 1st of your junior year that student athletes can have some of these direct interactions and face-to-face conversations with Division I coaches as well. And again, it's never too early to get that exposure so that you're on their recruiting radar. And also, you know, as early as possible, giving coaches a face to put to a name so when they get that email from you, you know, on September 2nd of your junior year, they're not thinking, who's this Bonnie Pettis person? They're thinking, Bonnie, that name rings a bell. You know what? I had a conversation with her at Head First in Long Island, and we talked about, she took up knitting during the quarantine or whatever the case may be. She kind of has that personal touch point to add to it as well. One final question, then we're gonna cut everybody loose. I know that we're well over now. One final question that I think is fairly tactical and maybe quick, but also not super straightforward. When do we think high academic schools will decide about offering on-campus camps this summer? And the short answer for this one, in my opinion, and Bonnie, I'm curious for yours, is it's going to depend school by school. A couple things need to happen before they're able to do that. One is there is still an ongoing NCAA dead period. It's currently slated to go through April, the middle of April. Whether or not that gets extended one more time, 2 more times, another month or so, that remains to be seen. So that needs to be lifted so that Division I coaches can conduct on-campus, face-to-face recruiting. The other piece of it is, even if that gets lifted on April 15th and they can host a camp on April 16th, is that individual school's administration going to be comfortable having student athletes come onto campus from all over the place and host them on campus? We talk with a number of schools. We talk with a lot of schools that run their own on-campus camps. And right now, the sense that I have is that they're optimistic about a late summer or a fall camp, but it's going to depend school by school. Some schools are going to be able to say, yep, we'll see you on July 20th. Others are going to say, you know, we had this camp scheduled for September 10th. Now actually it's going to have to be pushed back to November, and actually it's going to come off the board, just depending on each administration's and each athletic department's comfort with it. I think that you'll probably start to see some announcements about this in the months of March and April, about ones that are on tentatively on, some that gets canceled. I would think maybe in the next couple months you start to see them, but it will, again, vary pretty widely depending on the program and each athletic department and each administration. Bonnie, is there anything that you're hearing on that front?
Everything you've said is what I would say in terms of it's going to be directed by the university and then other state and municipal rules about gatherings and so on. I have heard of a team within the Head First cohort that did have a one-day camp because they ran it at a park, not at the university. Some people may be, if they have that option to be creative and it's allowed, their university allows them to do that and their city allows them to do that, you may see some same type of things in other locations. We had your rival Williams did a virtual hitting camp, right? So
hey, that's creative. I can't fault you for that.
Where they had homework and they had to send stuff back, and they had, it was a very lively, interactive thing. So it wasn't. The coaches they're changing speed the best they can. I mean, I would never have thought of that. I don't think as a college coach, but they made a way to create interaction and to create normal recruiting. That's what they did.
And I love that creativity. And I mean, I think that one thing that the last year has brought out in college athletics in particular is creativity. I mean, coaches are giving Zoom tours of campus. They're leveraging all these different platforms to do it. I will say that is something that is tough. Like is your target program going to host their on-campus camp? Maybe, maybe not, but it's not something, as we talked about, that you're in control of. And I will say, I mean, maybe a shameless plug, maybe not. Head First is planning on running these events, and we ran events this past fall in a safe way, socially distanced way, with small groups, with Division III, non-Division I coaches on site. We're planning for a regular summer of our events with Division I coaches on site in California and New York. Maybe there are some things that have to change about those camps, but I think that in terms of student athletes controlling what you all can control, we are going to be offering recruiting opportunities, whether they involve Division I coaches or if the dead period is somehow extended through the summer, whether they don't, but instead they involve a lot of video and these other tools that coaches are relying on, kind of remains to be seen. We're optimistic about the prospect of running our camps as planned this summer, and that's what we're planning for. We're also building out contingencies, but we are going to be running events. And so if you're targeting these sorts of schools, this is one way that you can get in front of them, is whether or not the Williams camp is digital or in person, or the Harvard camp ever happens, that you can get your information in front of them and get exposure to them through an honor roll camp that might fit your schedule. So take that for what it's worth. I will say thank you to everybody who joined us. I'm gonna wrap it up now. Thank you all for taking a portion of your Tuesday night. If you have any questions at all, please take a look and feel free to send us an email, give us a call. If you pop onto our website, you'll see a little pop-up in the bottom right corner that with our live chat feature to talk with one of our representatives. If you have questions for Bonnie, feel free to touch base with her directly. Check out their website as well. And we certainly hope to see you all somewhere on down the line in your recruiting process. Or if not, we wish you the best of luck and hopefully see you in 2 weeks on the next installment of this series as well.
Yeah, thank you very much, everybody, for joining us tonight.